Welcome to the Yeoman Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Graham. On Yeoman, I'll speak with people who build and grow things, people who create art, and people who think about community, meaning, and purpose. My guest today is Akiva Silver. Akiva is the owner of Twisted Tree Farm in Spencer, New York, and the author of Trees of Power, 10 Essential Arboreal Allies. You can purchase Trees of Power in his other books, as well as his seeds, scion shrubs, bare root trees at twistedtree.net. That's twisted-tree.net. Also on his site, you will find a great many articles and videos. Akiva has generously and patiently shared his deep growing experience on his site and on plenty of podcasts. I don't believe he's on Twitter, though you can find him on Instagram at ttfarm279. And you can, of course, also find him here today on Yeoman. Akiva, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
All right. Thanks for having me.
If I may, I'd like to start our conversation with the following quote from the first chapter of Trees of Power, and then ask you to elaborate a bit. You write, "The highest level of appreciation comes through participation. I hope this," and then you go on, "I hope this book inspires you to gather and plant. The trees here," by which you mean the specific trees you describe in the latter chapters, "the trees here are some of the most enjoyable beings on earth to work with. If you watch for them, they will overwhelm you sometimes. It will seem like they are merely offering you thousands of pounds of food and seed for free, but they have their own interests at heart. By taking from them, you will be helping them. You will be partnered."
Nice. I like that.
Yeah, who wrote that? That was great. I love that. I love the notion that you present through particularly the first half of the book, before you get into the specific trees, of humans as reminding us to see humans as part of our ecosystem and as the nature around us as things that we exist with rather than apart from.
Yeah.
Can you tell me how that's, tell me when you first began thinking that way?
Well, I'm not sure when, but I think some of these things we just realize slowly, but I've come to the reality that we're in a conversation with nature, and whether you're working with a little tiny backyard or a patio or a big farm or a wilderness area, or whether you own property or not, we're always in this conversation, and there's an action and there's a response. So if you're mowing the grass, every week and not doing anything else, it seems like, oh, there's no conversation, but that's actually a pretty significant conversation that's taking place, and a pretty loud response. And so that's why I think like participation can create a really deep conversation when you're noticing it and you're doing things, but it's not just about enforcing your will. I want to put an orchard here, or I want to have a garden here. It's more about like starting to do stuff and then seeing how it feels, seeing how the land responds, what kind of results are you getting. As we do things, you can tell fairly soon how it feels, if it's just flowing and happening almost effortlessly, and things are just kind of moving really easily, or the opposite. You start doing stuff and it just feels impossible, and then this thing breaks and that thing breaks, and it just doesn't feel right. But there's times when it feels right, and that's where the conversation is really peaking, I think, is when you're noticing how your actions feel in the moment. And then you can see when your actions feel really good in the moment, then the result, the response that comes later, maybe that response is noticed like a year later or 2 years later or 10 years later, but it's usually pretty profound. So, like, for example, let's say I'm planting a bunch of seedlings out on in a field, and as I'm going, I don't feel good. The weather sucks. There's a lot of clay and rocks, and I just feel like I'm kind of just shoving these trees into the ground, and like I hope they work, but I don't really know. Then there's other times when just the soil it's not too wet, it's not too dry. The roots just feel like they just slip right in. You step back from what you just did, and it feels right. And those plantings often work out a lot better. So I think there's this whole conversation taking place in which we're being told if we're in the flow of things, if we're if we're reflecting. It's the same if I'm having a conversation with a person. You can kind of tell if it's going well or if it's hitting walls. And when you hit walls, you kind of have to redirect and reassess and rethink about things. So that's how I feel what it's like to work with nature. I'm constantly like starting something and I'm like, nah, and I just abandon it. As soon as it doesn't feel good, I just abandon it. It's like, why force an issue? It's like if you're talking to someone, they're clearly not listening to you, then what's the point of just keep trying to tell them something? It's better to just, all right, let's talk about something else, or I'll go talk to a different person, or I'll go be by myself now. And I think that's what it has to be like if you're working in the garden also. It's like, it's got to feel good. It's got to feel right and smooth.
You began, well, how long ago did you begin farming?
I've had the property I'm on, I've been working with for 15 years. I got it in 2009. And then I was doing some stuff for a couple years before that at a place I was renting. But most of my background is actually more about like foraging and wilderness survival and primitive skills. So, which is also a tremendous conversation to have, just to try to find and gather your own food and materials from the wild.
I've listened to you share that with in other conversation, other podcasts, and you write about that a good bit in the book. And as that was your kind of path to beginning to grow trees in a way, if I have it right, tell me if this is about right. You started to appreciate through observation the how much wildlife, how much nature was in the presence of human settlement, and how positively we could impact what happens in nature. Is that kind of the beginnings of your path into farming?
Yeah, absolutely. Because when I first, I grew up just typical American middle class childhood. Nothing, not really immersed in nature at all, or paying attention in any way to the plants and animals around me. So when I first started getting really interested, I just kind of started out with the philosophy that I think is more or less mainstream in our society, is that nature is really good and pure, and people are really bad and really dirty, and we just make a mess of things. And so if you want to see nature, you need to get as far away from people as you can, and anything they do is just kind of contaminating it. And so you have this whole concept of, leave no trace camping, like leave only footprints, take only pictures kind of ideas. And I just assumed that that's the way to be, is just to kind of like move through the earth, making as little noise as possible. Like not necessarily noise, but like, not leaving any evidence that I was there, as little as possible. But
Right.
But the more time that I spent in nature, And you can spend a lot of time in nature and not really get much out of it. But I was really engaged because I was trying to learn.
And what age were you at this point? How old were you here?
21, I think. Yeah. I'm 45 now. But yeah, I read some books and I got very excited about this idea of wilderness survival. And if you try to get to the point, and I was not just wilderness survival, but I wanted to go to like primitive, Stone Age technology only. I didn't want to like survive with a knife and anything. I just wanted to be able to make all the tools, just hunt and forage and do it in like this I had this purist mentality, which was, had some drawbacks, but it was also really good because when you start trying to do things like that, like if you're trying to harvest food and you don't have anything except your hands, then you wind up really having to tune in. So you make stone tools. It doesn't mean you just pick up any rock and break it open. You have to really understand the way there's different types of rocks and how they break. And then, if you're trying to catch a wild animal like a rabbit or a chipmunk or whatever, you have to understand, what do they eat? What do they do? And I didn't know any of that stuff. So it created a need for very deep observation, really paying attention to details and trying to understand how to read tracks and what bird language is and what's happening in the woods and where to find different types of plants. And so you spend a lot of time just like constantly being curious and asking questions and trying to figure things out. I'm the kind of person, I tend to go kind of deep with things if I get interested in them seriously. And I became really obsessed, and I was just spending every possible minute in thickets in the woods. If I had to be somewhere like a family gathering or something, I would always wander off at some point and go and find some thicket somewhere or some little patch of weeds, anything, and I would crawl around in there and just observe everything I could. I wanted to know about the soil underneath the plants, like why were they growing there. I just wanted to know everything. And the more that I observed, the more I started to understand that wildlife is actually way more abundant near places of great disturbance. Almost like the more disturbance there's been, that's where the more animals and birds are, and plant diversity as well. Now there's certain kinds of plants that'll only grow not in undisturbed areas, but as far as just like being able to find food and see animals and hear birds, it was not in the deep mountains at all. It was always like in the junkyard behind Walmart kind of place, along the highways. And so once I started to observe that, it just became more and more apparent. It's kind of like once you see something, you start seeing more of it. And so then that kind of led me to realize, people aren't necessarily bad for nature, and they can actually create more diversity and more abundance, and they're doing it for the most part unintentionally and by accident. And so once I realized that, I thought, what if we did it on purpose? What if we created these disturbances on purpose? And so then I couldn't stop. Just the whole concept of enhancing an ecosystem to the point where there's more birds and more animals and more types of flowers and fruit and herbs was so exciting to me. So I just been like building ponds and planting trees ever since.
How long before this did you get your property? As I recall, you were growing things on the side and working in landscaping. Is that right? Well, you kind of were.
Yeah, and I was
building a tree farm.
Right, and I did a lot of wilderness education programs with kids for years. That was like throughout my 20s. I was just doing that kind of stuff. And then I got my property when I turned 30, I think. Yeah, that makes sense. I can't remember all these things, but
Sure.
yeah. So yeah,
when I came across your work, when I first learned of your work, I think you had 5 acres.
Oh no!
But I believe you started much smaller than that, and now you're much bigger. Is that right?
No, I bought 20 acres. It's the only property I've ever owned, and it was 20 acres when I got it, and I've been here the whole time. So,
has the area you've been farming grown?
Yeah, I mean the 20 acres has been like, it's been a long time to get it, so it's starting to feel filled in. And there's still quite a bit that I'd like to do on it, but it's started more and more. It's starting to be like, okay, it's starting to fill up. And I use more and more of it every year.
Can you share a bit about the growth of your business?
Sure.
When you started selling trees, how that happened,
right?
And where you are now.
Yeah, I started before I moved here, so I was still renting, and I would just collect seeds and dig up seedlings, and I would just put them in a pot and then put it on Craigslist was what people used back then, to sell things, and I would just sell things on Craigslist for like a little bit of side money, and then we bought our property and moved here, and I was still just doing it like that. I would just like sell some stuff on Craigslist or through plant walks I would give, and then I just, once I was here, it was kind of I just didn't want to leave. Like I didn't want to drive somewhere to go work somewhere else. And whenever I did, all I could think about was things that I wanted to work on at home. So I started daydreaming, like, how can I actually make money at home? And me and my friend Sean Dombrowski, who owns Edible Acres, he's a really good old friend of mine. But I remember I said to him, I said, how can I make money at home? And he looked at me and he goes, plant propagation. And I was like, you're right. And I knew it. And I just started putting everything I could into the nursery and moving plants, and built a website and just advertised in every way that I could think of to get the word out that I had trees, and I just started growing as many as I could. And once I really decided I wanted to do it, it took probably 2 or 3 years before it became my full-time job.
And how can you give us a sense of the scale of the business now, like the number of customers you have, the number of trees you're selling, those kinds of things?
Yeah, I don't keep like very good records, but I think we generally move about 10,000 seedlings a year, and usually, I think this spring I sent out maybe 600 orders to different people, and then there's always people that stop by and just come and get stuff. But it definitely is like it's more than adequate income. Gives me some flexibility and creativity. I don't feel like I have to work that hard. I don't have to like kill myself trying to make ends meet or anything like that. I'm not one of these people that's runs a farm and is all busy and stressed out all the time. I probably, like, as far as like work where I'm growing things to sell is, and then dealing with customers and packaging plants up, is it probably amounts to about 15 hours a week. So anywhere like 10 to 20 hours a week, I'd say. And
do you have support?
What's that?
Do you have support, or seasonally? Do you?
Yeah, I used to have a lot more. At one point, I had 5 people working for me. Now I just have one guy who comes half a day a week. But I don't know. It's kind of like up to me and how I feel. Like I could make this business as big or as little as I want. And so I just found kind of a happy medium where it's not stressful and it's big enough, like, and I can just I like the size it's at now because it's easy to add new things or take away other things as I feel like. So, like last year I grew a lot of black locusts and sold them, and then this year I just didn't even feel like starting any, and I doing more with berries and aquatic plants. So it's just kind of like fun. It's just like grow what you feel like, and people are out there who want plants. So
it seems to me like you always sell out of pretty much everything. Is that right?
I think so. There's sometimes there'll be things left over. Like this year, we finished our shipping season about a week ago, actually, and once I've sent out the last order, you kind of look around and you're like, what's left here that would be nice to not have to grow for another year in the nursery. And there was like a pile of about 1,000 chestnut seedlings, and I was like, oh, I didn't sell these. But then I had a guy who wanted all. He contacted me that day and he bought all of them. So that was good. But sometimes I have extras, but usually I can sell everything out because the internet is very big and I'm very small. So
yeah.
I mean, like, it sounds like a lot, like 10,000 seedlings, but when you think about the size of the country and people, because people order our plants, I'm in New York State and they might be in Ohio or Florida or Washington or Vermont. There's just people all over just gardening, and they're Googling stuff, and they're like, oh, I want echinacea, I want an apple tree, that variety, and there's so many people. So
when did you start writing about it? The book, I have to say, is beautiful. And for people listening or watching, I don't know that I've read another book about it like it. It's half manifesto, maybe the first half, and then the second half kind of a field guide to 10 of your favorite trees of power, your magnetic trees. Kind of a deep dive into helping people understand each of these trees, how to grow them, specific things about them. But the first half is very much a manifesto. When did you start writing?
I don't know. I think I've always written, just for fun. I've always just been like, kind of like, just like a hobby, I guess. And then before I wrote the book, I used to write a lot of articles, which was actually how I built the business, I think, in a lot of ways. Was I would write articles, and then I would just, I just get excited about something and can't stop thinking about it, so I have to write it down. And so I'd write about American plums and why they're such a cool tree, and then I would take that article and I would just share it with every listserv I could, and just tell people, hey, here's another article I put out. It's like free. There's no ads in it or anything, and so I don't know. I just always
sounds like you built credibility, I guess.
It was like a way to build it
and reading the book
for the plants and stuff. Because then I didn't do it for selfish reasons. I was just I genuinely wanted to talk about how cool American plums were. But then people would be like, I want to grow that. And I'd be like, oh, okay, cool. I have a bunch of seedlings. So it was a good way to help get the word out. And I would submit those articles to newsletters, like native plant societies and stuff like that.
You, the first tree of power that you begin talking about in the book is the chestnut tree. And you spend a great deal of time on that, both a tragic and a hopeful story with regard to the American chestnut. Would I be, I don't know if this is true, but would I be right in sensing that you have a soft spot in your heart for the chestnut?
Yeah. Say it's more like, at least at the time I wrote the book, it wasn't so much a soft spot as like an obsession. I just could not stop thinking about chestnuts for several years. Once I like realized what these trees are and what they do, I just can't even believe how phenomenal they are, and just there needs to be more. Like we lost so many, and it's like it's not hard now to bring them back, and it's like these trees belong in our landscape, and our landscape is really missing something without them. And like, for example, if you start looking at nut trees in general, walnuts or beech nuts or oaks or any of the wild nut trees, pines even, like what any kind of pine makes a nut, right? And you start looking at these trees, they actually don't make a crop every year. And most of them will be like every 2 or 3 years. And some are even worse. There's some beech trees will make a crop every 7 years, 10 years. Pines, it's like every 3 or 4 you'll get a good crop. Black walnuts, it's every couple years. And you think about, okay, big deal, whatever. But if you are an animal that depends on a high protein source dropping from trees, if you're depending on nuts, and you have years where there's nothing, where the acorns just didn't drop at all because there was none, then wildlife populations goes through these boom and bust cycles. And nowadays, if you read about wildlife, it's considered normal for squirrels to go through boom and bust cycles with their population. Absolute peaks and crashes are regular and considered normal. But I don't think that used to be the case. So chestnuts are unique in that they bear nuts pretty much every single year. So like the chestnut grower I work with, Brian, he's been growing chestnuts for almost 50 years now, and he's had a crop every single year. There was only 1 year he had a very small crop, but pretty much every other year he's had a really substantial crop. And so if you have trees like that in the landscape, then the walnuts can fluctuate, the oaks can fluctuate, but the chestnuts were like a cornerstone that kind of kept the whole system from getting too far out of balance. And so you didn't have to have gigantic numbers of animals starving to death because there's no food. So there's just one way that I think chestnuts were very important in our landscape of just keeping the whole thing in check from swinging too far high and low. You know what I mean?
So you and I are on the subject of chestnuts and the abundance of them. In the book, you spend at least a couple pages talking about Charles Mann's book, 1491, and which is a book I highly recommend to people about the state of the New World prior to European arrival en masse. And the book is kind of in two parts, as I recall, a lot on South America and a lot on North America, two very different civilizations there. But the picture of North America Mann paints in 1491, as I recall, is one of enormous abundance and probably as populous as Europe, healthy. Certainly there are skirmishes, but largely pretty peaceful. And I wonder, at least on the East Coast or in the eastern parts of the state, how much the chestnut had to do with that. As you described the abundance around them, I think that probably it was critical there.
yeah. So to give you an example, I looked at the first forestry survey for my county and Tioga County, New York State, and they list 50% of the trees in this county were chestnut. So it was a very dominant tree, and I would imagine those were massive groves that sustained people and sustained wildlife populations, and had a lot to do with just, providing like a real solid source of basically bread for people and animals that was there every single year. And I think that it must have had a lot to do with just creating stable societies and system and ecosystems.
And they were in our forests. This was new to me in Man's book. The idea that Europe or that North America was as populous, if not more populous, than Europe at the same time, comparable size,
right? Like
landmass.
He talks about
well,
go ahead.
No, please.
He talks about how the Pilgrims come over on the Mayflower and land at Plymouth Rock is like the story we know, but the beginning of that story is for a couple decades before that. They kept sending ships over, and the ships had nowhere to go. They would get to the East Coast, and it was filled with towns of the native people. And it wasn't like, oh, we'll just settle here and start this new world. No, this new world was filled to the brim with civilization, and there was nowhere for them to go. So they would get their boat there, they would do some trading, and then they'd go back to Europe. They couldn't stay there. There's nowhere to go. And then one day they came back, in 1620 when the Mayflower lands, and they get there, and I don't know if that's the right year, but they get there, and all these villages are empty, and they're like, oh, well, we can settle here now because all these people are gone. They had all died from disease. But yeah, it was very populated.
Yeah, it's interesting. To think about what early Europeans experienced largely when they experienced the New World was really a post-apocalyptic New World. Like 95% of people had just died within the span of one generation.
Right.
And
can you imagine
and even that first Thanksgiving story of Squanto, like he was, yeah, what would that be like? That would be it would truly be like the worst conceivable apocalypse.
Right, and you're trying to talk to these people and assess culture.
And then these giant forests, and meanwhile you show up and you think, oh, we found.
Right, you're just talking to the survivors of something incredibly tragic that had just happened, and it's I don't think we really understand what it was like, to walk into a place like that had just lost almost everybody. If somebody showed up to New York City now, they have one experience, but if they show up to New York City after, almost everyone had died, they'd be like, they would have a totally different take on what that civilization was. So.
Right. And they walked into this enormous abundance, this Eden of massive forests of great production, not fully appreciating that these had been cultivated over many, many, many generations to be the way they were. And, and just so much abundance in that place relative to what they were used to. It for me was the first time I was really starting to think about, what civilization meant and what it had, how closed mind is not the right word, but how limited a view we had on all the different ways that people have achieved prosperity. Because there was certainly great, widely shared prosperity in North America in 1491, certainly relative to Europe.
Yeah, it wasn't recognized because it was so foreign, and all those systems were collapsing when Europeans were getting here, because the diseases like the flu and smallpox, they traveled faster than the Europeans did. So they were, by the time the Europeans would arrive somewhere, the disease had already played out, in a lot of cases. So
right, they advanced with feral pigs, right? Pigs carried them. That it advanced along with pigs that had gone feral as they sort of kind of spread out eastward. Is that right?
I was just imagining it was like, so let's say, a group of people goes out and trades with some ship that just arrived in New England, and then they now have influenza, and then they bring it back to their town, but then somebody from their town travels to a town further west, and then they bring it to that town, and then someone from that town is traveling around and they bring it to another town. And I think people just kind of carry it around too, but I guess it doesn't really matter now. It's just one of these remarkable stories from the history of this earth that just never seems to run short of amazing, horrifying, and awesome stories. There's just so many at this point.
God, I hadn't thought about it, but the chestnut and the chestnut's experience is a bit of a, it's totally paralleled to that experience of
the chestnut story is really old and a really good one. So if you think about chestnuts, like there's chestnuts native to America, and there's chestnuts native to Japan, and there's chestnuts native to Europe, right? And so, like, okay, well, did these trees just spring up? Like there was all of a sudden a new species of chestnut popped up in America, and then another one popped up in Japan totally separately? No, I'm sure that they had a common ancestor, like the original kind of chestnut tree, and it's happened so long ago that it was when all these continents were actually connected, back in the days of Pangea. So they're like, that's how old the chestnuts are. They were around when these trees were across this great continent, and then the continent split apart, mountain ranges formed, and it was like long periods of time. And the American chestnut is now living in like Maine and Georgia and all these different places, and it's adapting to its environment. It gets really cold here. We have this kind of disease. We have this kind of insect, and it just keeps adjusting and growing and becoming from that. And I have to live along with white pines that grow 250 feet tall, and so it has to learn different things. And then some other group of chestnuts is living in like southern China, and they're dealing with a whole different set of circumstances. And so each species kind of figured out its own way to survive where it was. And now we're in this period of globalization, and the chestnuts face different challenges. They're facing new challenges, and all those different species that popped up in those different places, now they all know different things, and they have a chance to come back together and share what they learned. It sounds kind of weird, but it's actually very true. So some chestnuts learn.
No, I love you described that in that chestnut chapter, and it's such a wonderful. I hadn't, I feel like we've obsessed over helping the American chestnut along to remain solely an American chestnut, but be blight resistant.
Right, and so if we want to,
and yet you paint this really lovely story of
So I
go ahead.
We want to like reunite the American chestnut with its long lost cousins. It's like you need to talk to your ancient siblings that have been in Japan this whole time, because they know how to deal with chestnut blight, and you clearly don't. And so you bring them back together, and they can have a conversation, and they have sex, and they make new babies, and those babies can do the things the American ones could do, and the things the Asians can do. And you can create these phenomenal trees that are well adjusted to this world, because they have learned so much over this incredibly long period of time in all these different places. So it's almost like unfair to not allow them to do that and just be like, no, we just want to grow the American ones. I feel like it's so short-sighted. It's like, well, you're saying it's an American chestnut, but well, look at the history of where these trees come from. They were here before the continent of North America even looked like this. And so who are you to say this is this species and that's that species? That's how I feel about it. It's like these trees, they get along with each other, and only people are the ones that want to keep them apart. And there are people that actually really do want to keep them apart, and they don't want, the different genetics to get mixed. And I don't know. That kind of sucks for them, I think, because there's a lot of plants in this world, and if we don't start using them, we're really missing out. It's like, I don't know. Why not? Why not take advantage of this incredible diversity we have on this planet? Not be limited to our own boundaries that we've drawn on maps and decide, oh, this is where this belongs and that's where that belongs. Everything's been moving around the whole planet for so much longer than we've been here anyways, But, hey.
Well, you talk about people as caretakers. Like that's our proper, we're gardeners of the globe. We're caretakers. Actually, there's a great quote. The foreword to this book, Trees of Power, is authored by Samuel Thayer. He has this beautiful introduction. Let me see. I'd love to read this. He says, it relates to this topic. We are not aboard a doomed ship bobbing in a frigid sea. We are on Earth, exactly where we are supposed to be, surrounded by all that we need in a garden that needs tending. Then he goes on a little later. Trees are the answer to so many of our ills and the ladder to so many of our dreams. They are the arms and hands of the earth, reaching up to the heavens on our behalf, grasping the slippery currency of sunlight and rendering it, through their wondrous alchemy, into the stuff of life, our life and theirs. Thought that was beautiful, and it spoke to me to this reminder, or I don't know if it's a reminder, but it was a reminder to me, but it might be new to some people, that we don't exist like it's not our purpose to try and make the world a completely natural place. It's our purpose to be stewards of it and to care for it and to help it grow and develop in this great way. And to me, that was such an optimistic message in the same way that you're thinking about chestnut trees, just this optimistic, positive message of a great role that we can play, as stewards, or I think the word, I don't know if you ever used the word steward.
Yeah, I don't know.
Over and over.
I mean, I think people can kind of frame themselves in any way, and I've heard it spoken that we're a cancer on the earth, and then I've heard, oh, we're supposed to be caretakers, and I think everything in between exists in people's minds, and we can think of ourselves lots of different ways. And I don't know. I mean, I'm just thinking this right in this moment, but I wonder if like the whole idea of being a caretaker is a little bit egotistical and thinking, oh, I know the answers, I'll take care of you. Whereas like, I really like going back to that whole idea of participation and conversation, and we're just here with everything else, trying to figure it out, and I think just participating and interacting in a conscious way, in a way where you're paying attention to what's being said back to you. Because like a conversation where you're just talking and talking and talking and you don't even listen when the other person speaks is not a conversation. So it's like, if you're actually like doing something and then being curious about what the response will be, I think you're in a good place. And so I don't know if that's necessarily like stewardship or caretaking, but it does mean that you care what's happening, so you're taking care.
And you take care.
But you're not like a babysitter, you're not like raising children. When you're working with nature, like maybe part of that is, you're raising baby plants and whatever, but you're doing it as part of a whole system. And And you really, I don't know. I think nature is so phenomenally complex that there's so much we don't know. It's not, there's way more we don't know than we do. So I think if we're not constantly reaching back into curiosity, then we're just gonna make crazy blunders. And we're gonna make big blunders anyways. But at least if we're like reaching back into curiosity, we can keep making adjustments and corrections and, you know, moving more the way things move, you know, like there's like the more I observe, the more I want to be like what I'm seeing. So like when I'm watching like clouds move or I'm seeing the way water moves, I want to be more like that. And it's pretty great just really listening and trying to fit in with everything, because you don't want to be like the weird guy at the party that doesn't fit in. You want to fit in and get along with everyone and have a good time. And so that's kind of how it is in the garden. I think you want to fit in too. You don't want to be the Lord. I am taking care of everyone here. I know what's best, and I read really good books on permaculture, so I know what to do here. It's like, nah, I think you just want to be like a guy at the party who's having fun and engaging in wonderful conversations that are very stimulating, eye-opening, and you know, and then there's no conclusions. There's really no conclusions. If you start paying attention to this earth, it's not a place of conclusions. Every story has no ending. You know, the story of the chestnut didn't end. The story of the native people on this continent didn't end. These stories just keep going. Even after things die and disappear, there's always this ripple effect that continues forever and on into the next story, and there's really no break between them. So yeah, I don't know. It's a great place to get to experience life, I think.
I love that. It's you talk about being curious and not egotistical in your approach. I mean, kind of a first step toward curiosity is maybe humility. And trying to approach it all with it.
Yeah. I think like curiosity for me comes alive from faith and like trusting that the powers that make all this happen know what's going on. And so if I'm in a place of faith where I'm like, I think the universe knows what it's doing when it spins these planets this way, or I think God knows what it's doing when people go through these things, then it helps you not be like, oh, this is really bad. Look at all this garlic mustard, or look at all this like Japanese knotweed, or this infestation of beetles. It's just the worst thing ever, and you're just freaking out about it. But more like, well, it's here for a reason, and I don't know what it is, but it's, you know, it just helps you be more. That's how I think curiosity comes to me, is more from being in a state where I don't think things are happening by accident or just because life sucks and so bad crap happens. You know, it's more like I think everything's here on purpose, though.
You were, how do I put it? You're gentle, very gentle in your critiques in this book of ways of thinking about things. But you're still, I would say, you're a bit critical of pessimism and cynicism in the book, and particularly for...
that's what we fight against our whole life, is not letting those cynical forces take over our minds. And the older you get and the more life you go through, they're going to keep coming stronger and trying to get you. And you got to watch out for it. You know, there's like that Tom Petty song, people come, people go, some grow young, some grow cold. You know, that's the real danger. You got to watch out for is that bitterness, that cynicism. It'll sneak up on you. It's so insidious. It's always trying to get you. And you can see it when you look at old people's faces. You can see who it happened to and who it didn't. And you can see like their face gets like permanently stuck in these positions. And it's like, oh, I don't want to do that. And then you see someone else who's old, and you can see there's like a love in their face, in their eyes, and that's the real work and the real battle, is to not let the darkness take over your mind, because it wants to. It's like hungry. So, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I love that your book is a constant reminder of that all the way through this conversation too. I feel like there is, you don't ever use the word anti-humanism in the book, or a friend of mine, Steve Muzan, he has the phrase gizmo green, where people trying to come up with hyper technological solutions to problems. But I feel like some chapters, some of the little sections in the book, it's as if you're grabbing the cynic or the pessimistic cynic by the shoulders and shaking them and saying, "Hey, wake up.
Yes.
There's a lot to be optimistic about, and you can do it right now. You can go do good things. Go do good things."
Yeah, I mean, just like,
I think you said, it actually, there's some parts of it that are stoic. Do you consider yourself a kind of a stoic philosopher? Because there's a lot in here that reminded me of stoic writings.
I have to confess that I'm ignorant, and I'm not sure what. I've heard of Stoicism, but I don't actually know what it means. So sorry.
Well, there's one quote. I can't. I think it was Marcus Aurelius, and I'm paraphrasing, but he more or less says, "Don't waste your time debating what it means to be a good man. Go be one."
Mm.
And I love that in your little section on To the Environmentalists, where you're giving them a challenge. You say the best way to create change is to create alternative options that are so much more appealing than the status quo. And then you flow from that into a discussion of what is your sphere of influence, and to focus on the things that are within your control to change. It's a really great reflection.
Well, I think it's very easy to complain about things, and there's a lot that you can complain about, and it's much harder and takes more energy to make something and to be brave enough to like kind of show it to other people. But you look at the whole world, and it's like, oh my God, it's so overwhelming. The oceans, like the rainforest in Indonesia, the orangutans. And it's like, oh my God, and climate change. It's just like so many things, and it's extremely overwhelming. But I like the idea of having focusing on your sphere of influence, because if you're just overwhelmed and talking about how bad everything is, then you're just kind of making it worse. And but if you're focused on your sphere of influence, where do I actually have an impact? How can I help? Then, oh man, you're busy. You got things to do, and your sphere of influence might just be in your home with your like 2 kids, or I don't know what everybody's situation is, but if you recognize this is where I can be effective, then you're busy and you got things to do, and you don't really have. It's like a waste of your time and energy to be complaining about other things. So it's nice to recognize what your sphere of influence is, and and then you're doing something great. And like I said, there's no conclusions. You're not going to save the world, but you're probably going to make it a little better for one person or 100 people, or for this little patch of ground, or for those birds that live in the neighborhood, or for some bats that you just built a bat house for. And like, I don't know, it's a great thing to not feel like we're just these like victims of this like really harsh world, because we are and we're not. There's a lot to do. So
absolutely. Well, this is probably a perfect place to wrap up. I'd love to come up and visit. Can I come visit the farm?
Sure. People come here all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like it on the website. The website for Twisted Tree Farm is, again, twisted-tree.net. My guest has been Akiva Silver, a great optimist and a man who plants trees. Akiva, thank you so much Thank you so much for joining us on Yeoman.
Sure. Thank you so much for letting me speak and listening.